Welcome to the first lifespan, life stage video of this course in human behavior in the social environment. You will notice in this first video that we talk about a number of terms you already know. Now, I'm assuming that you've watched the earlier first 3 units of this course, and if you haven't, this would be a good time to stop and go back, because each one of these builds on the previous ones. We've talked about all of these. Take a look, and if you don't remember what they are, it would also be a good time to stop and Google the terms you don't understand. In this unit, there are several things that are important to our understanding. Neuroplasticity is key. Neuroplasticity is the ability of the brain to change structurally and functionally based on experience. From the bottom up, we know that the brain develops from the very bottom, from the spinal cord all the way up and out to the front part of the brain, which is also that handles the higher functioning. Fetal programming. We'll talk about how knowledge communicated to the fetus in the uterus shapes the fetus's development in ways to enhance survival. Epigenetic development. We will consider some of the things, especially from the genetics unit, when we talk about how experience, both of the fetus and of the mother, influences development. We'll talk about the role of stress in development, and we will talk about poverty and racism and how even at this early stage of development, they have a big role to play in how the infant develops. So let's talk about conception. I'm sure you'll remember from the genetics unit that recombination is the natural formation of an offspring with new genetic combinations not present in the parents by the process of crossing over or independent assortment. If you'll recall, looking at this slide, if you think of one parent as the red and one parent as the white on the far left, you can see that they combine in some kind of random order, and you come up with new combinations on the far right that don't look like either parent. And this is how the species has developed to have so much variety. We wouldn't want to be the same as we've always been. So let's talk again briefly, and I think we covered this earlier, but just to remind you that how this works out is that mother's DNA, which carries the possibility of a number of traits and a number of characteristics, and father's DNA, which also does that, recombine in really interesting ways. I have my mother's height and cheekbones and her incredibly high energy level, but I have my father's nose, more the pity, and a steady temperament, and my 2 grandmothers' blue eyes, even though both of my parents have brown eyes. So each of us is really a fascinating combination of our parents and their parents and their parents and so on. Now, once this happens, once the DNA recombines, development is not over. There's still a couple of things going on before we get to baby doe on the far right here. First of all, we know that there are some methylation tags from before mother and dad that can hang on in certain cases. Most of them are wiped clean at the beginning, but then once conception takes place, we start getting new tags because there is experience even within the womb from the very beginning. So I want you to think about this. It's very hard to show everything that's going on because basically everything interacts all the time. But what you see is the fetus, the recombined DNA on the far left. What goes into development to baby doe? Well, the maternal grandmother's diet is significant. We've talked about that. Certainly the mother's diet is significant. Even father's stress at puberty plays a role. We talked about that in connection with the over-calyx study. During gestation, all of these things that you see in the middle have a role. So the family life, the resources the family has, the resources and environment in the community, and the fetal environment. So the baby's environment, the fetus's environment, is the uterus. The placenta connects mother and baby so that they share a blood supply, they share the nutrients mother consumes, they share the toxins mother consumes, and that's including drugs and alcohol, tobacco, anything else. They share hormones so that mother's hormonal reactions to stress are experienced also by the fetus. Something that's recently begun to be understood is that although the fetus's development is genetically programmed in terms of how or when things happen, the systems develop according to information from the uterine environment. So if the environment tells the fetus, it's dangerous out here, there's not enough food to eat, we're in the midst of war and we can be killed at any moment, then the fetus attempts to adapt to survive in the environment it is about to enter. Well, this works out just fine if the environment is actually that way when the fetus is born, but it can be harmful if the environment has shifted. A very famous example of this in some early research about it was done during World War II. The Germans blockaded food transports to the Netherlands between 44 and 45 as punishment for resistance since they were occupying the Netherlands. During that time, food rations fell to between 400 and 800 calories a day. The mortality rate in Amsterdam doubled in 1945, and no surprise, the birth rate fell dramatically. Babies who were born during this time were significantly smaller than their peers, which was measured by their siblings after the war who were not exposed to it. Well, it's not a surprise that they were born smaller. Pregnant women need to eat 300 or so calories more than their own needs daily to provide for the growth of a fetus. Of course they were small. But the interesting thing is that those effects lasted at least 3 generations. So think of it this way. The mother who experienced the famine is the first generation, called in genetics F0. The fetus, who was forming at the time, is the second generation, F1. And finally, we can think about the fact that if the fetus is a female, that fetus is forming her own eggs while she's still in the womb. So the third generation will be the F0's grandchildren. So far, research has shown that the effects hung on at least into the third generation. So those babies, F1, are now about 70 years old. The continuing research on them shows greater cognitive decline with age. The women have 5 times the risk of breast cancer And all the other diseases you see here are significantly more common among these individuals whose mothers experienced this famine. Mental illness has followed the same pattern. Now, I'm not going to show this video because it's pretty lengthy, but it is a very interesting one about the research that's been done with this group. If you miss or have difficulty copying this URL, just Google Dutch hunger winter and you'll find several. So returning to the notion of the fetal environment, I just want to remind you that all of these things are the environment of the fetus. We've got the mother's diet, we've got social support and stress in her environment, smoking, we've got drinking, and we see here a pregnant woman with her physician. I want to point out that just attending good prenatal care does not necessarily change birth outcomes, but it does enable the medical helpers to find conditions that sometimes can be treated. But really, the worst environment for a developing fetus is poverty. Now, why is poverty such a risk? Poverty means you have less income. What else does it mean? All of these things. Poverty really is stress, and it's stress from all of these many multiple directions. The poor certainly lack resources. They live in environments that are more violent and more stressful. They come to pregnancy less healthy, and many other aspects influence the development of the fetus that you can see here. How does this happen? I think we've known for a long time that infants born into poor families have much poorer birth outcomes. But how does that happen physiologically? This gives you some idea. You've seen the figures showing how the HPA axis works back in our third unit about stress hormones. Considering that the mother and baby share a bloodstream through the placenta, basically what this demonstrates, with all of its confusing acronyms, is that the mother's stress, which is expressed through her HPA axis and her sympathetic nervous system, results in a cascade of chemicals that are also experienced by the fetus. Now, if you'll notice way down at the bottom here, there is an interesting looking box that's talking about an enzyme that we'll just call 11-beta-HSD2 for convenience. In the woman, the pregnant woman, this enzyme is able to convert a reasonable amount of the flowing cortisol in the placenta into cortisone, which is harmless to the fetus. However, persistent high levels of corticoids can exhaust the supply of this enzyme, leading to higher levels of stress and early labor often for the fetus. Now, recall that higher levels of stress are associated with higher levels of circulating corticosteroids. This all comes on top of a woman's lifetime experience of stress. So basically, from the lifespan model that we've been talking about, we know that it accumulates over time and may make women more sensitive to stress, so that they're even flowing more cortisol when there is no immediate threat. And add to that the stress during pregnancy, and it may overwhelm the mother's enzyme and lead to higher levels of cortisol flowing through the baby's system. Now, remember that it is cortisol, or if you didn't know this, cortisol is also produced by the placenta itself, and particularly toward the end of labor, there is an increase in cortisol through the placenta that stimulates labor. If this is done too soon, we end up with premature labor. It also may trigger poor growth in the uterus, which is called intrauterine growth retardation. And it may cause, as we've studied before, high levels of cortisol downregulate the immune system, so you're much more prone to infection. So what else is going on during pregnancy that we need to think about? One of the things is a very important hormone called oxytocin. These pictures kind of illustrate a little bit about what we know about oxytocin. Oxytocin has been called the love hormone. It is higher in couples who are in that interesting first stage of romantic love. It is higher during orgasm. It is higher for people who are in the presence of people they're attached to. I know when I go out with my girlfriends in the evening, I can feel the oxytocin flowing. Oxytocin also plays a role in ripening the cervix so that labor starts. And interestingly, oxytocin remains important after the baby is born. Oxytocin stimulates breast milk to flow. And this is why you may sometimes see a woman's breast begin to leak when she hears her baby crying. The crying stimulates her body to produce milk. And finally, oxytocin plays a pretty big role in parenting because it is critical to the bond that forms between the mother and the infant that we'll talk about in the next unit. This little infographic talks a little bit about that, and we'll talk about that some more in the infants unit. Basically, these are interesting ways to increase oxytocin to improve health. All of these things have been associated with increased oxytocin. Now, I mentioned earlier that high levels of stress can make a woman more at risk for infection. As you will recall from the stress unit, when the HPA axis is in stress mode, when we're under threat, the immune system downregulates because it's not necessary for the very next second survival. This happens during pregnancy, and it makes a woman more subject to bacterial infections in the vagina. And this is actually pretty common, though quite difficult to diagnose. Under normal conditions, what happens when you are exposed to bacterial infection, chemicals called cytokines battle the infection by promoting inflammation. That is, they send more blood to the area for healing purposes. Cytokines also cause prostaglandins to be produced, and those ripen the cervix to prepare for labor and contractions. So there has been a feeling out there for some time that part of the increased poor outcome for African American women is that they have more infections. And although it's hard to diagnose those infections, there is some supportive evidence for this, that the increased stress of being a minority in this country makes women more likely to stress out and to be susceptible to infections. Now, what's the big deal if a baby's born early? Prematurity is defined as below 37 weeks gestation. These days, obstetricians really try to get women to stick, to think about going the entire 40 weeks. And they are reluctant to do anything to stimulate labor before 40 weeks. We'll talk about that in a moment. Intrauterine growth retardation means that a baby is born too small for its gestational age. So that'd be under 2,500 grams or about 6.5 pounds at birth. But there's also a curve you can look at, a schedule. So if a baby is born prematurely, let's say a month early, there's still a weight that they should have achieved by that point. And many babies are born not just too early, but also too small for that point in their gestation. So before 40 weeks, the brain is not finished growing and connecting properly for birth. We'll talk about that some more in a moment. Before 40 weeks, the baby's lungs are not mature and ready to draw in oxygen on their own, and there's not enough body fat. And these things are also more pronounced, especially the brain and the body fat, with growth retardation. Well, now we've gotten so used to hearing about premature babies, we started to think, well, the NICU, the Neonatal Intensive Care Unit, is doing a really good job at saving more babies. This is absolutely true. However, the fetus is not programmed to grow those last few weeks in a NICU, where it's noisy and overstimulating, where they're getting shots and testing, and it's simply not what the brain is expecting. So the more immature, the more premature a baby is when it's born, the poorer the outcomes long-term for that infant, and especially for infants who go home to poverty. Now, if you'll take a look at this fetal mortality or infant mortality table, you'll see that since 1960, we've done a fairly decent job, at least up to 2010, of lowering rates of infant mortality for all races. However, you will notice that the gap between blacks and whites persists, and that infant mortality among African American babies is still about twice as high as it is for white babies. One reason for this, of course, is that premature birth is one of the major risk factors, major risk factor for dying in the first year of life. So these stats go up to 2010. Take a look here. If you look at low birth weight, and these statistics just go from 1990 out to 2009, and this trend has continued since then. What you see is we are not doing very well at bringing down premature or low birth weight. In fact, low birth weight is going up a little bit, very persistently since 1990. And once again, you can see that although it's going up for everybody, it is especially going up for African Americans. If you will remember, right there in 2008, we had a big recession in this country. Many people entered poverty, and those who didn't become poor, according to federal guidelines, did lose resources. Some lost health care because they lost jobs. This was a bad time, and it's not likely that we're going to see a reversal in this trend until we find a way to reduce income inequality in this country. So the baby's brain is developing in those last few weeks. What's significant about that? Well, the thing to remember is that how stress affects the developing fetal brain is dependent upon when the stress occurs. And this shows you how the brain is developing from week 0 at conception all the way up to adulthood here, when the brain is believed to be pretty much fully developed. So you can see, as we talked about in the brain unit, it starts with neurogenesis, or cell birth. Shortly thereafter, the cells begin to migrate to the right place in the brain. They begin to grow axons and dendrites, which will enable them to connect with each other. Pruning begins, which is simply programmed cell death. Synaptic production actually begins to occur before birth, as the infant learns a few things like how to turn over and move muscles. And we see that myelination starts right about at birth. During the time when synaptogenesis is happening, thousands and thousands of synapses are forming every second. So high levels of stress that affect the mother affect the unborn fetus in ways that depend in part on when they occur. Now, this is scary because it may also be additive. Poor stress is related to so many things. As we talked about earlier, low income, poverty is stress. So all of these things lead the mother to eat more poorly. She can't afford good, nutritious food. High levels of stress cause people to either not eat or to eat junk food. And all of these things may be additive as well. So it's probably a rare pregnant woman who experiences stress, high levels of dangerous stress, for only a week or two during pregnancy. Many of the women who experience this experience it throughout their pregnancies. So the thing we often forget is that, based on that little graphic two slides back, the developing brain does not just require extra calories. It needs specific nutrients for specific processes. So, for instance, proper methylation requires essential fatty acids in the mother's diet. That's the only way that fatty sheath can form around the connections. The very lower parts of the brain require folate to develop properly. Folate, which is found in green vegetables. You can look at some more details here and see some specific nutrients required for specific processes, and should help us understand how the brain is not just smaller, although it may be. It's not just stunted. Particular processes of brain development are interrupted. So one thing we've always known, and there's plenty of evidence for this, is that mothers who are highly distressed and anxious during pregnancy have children who score lower on cognitive tests during their development. What we haven't paid as much attention to, probably, are the physical processes that mediate this. So reduced gray matter in the cortex is related to poor diet. Reduced plasticity of the hippocampus, necessary for learning. All of these things that result from high levels of stress, synaptic loss in the hippocampus, very important for learning. These are the mediating factors that lead to those lower scores, those cognitive scores that we understand now. There are a couple of general trends. So neurogenesis is just going crazy in the beginning of pregnancy. So a lack of important nutrients very early in pregnancy may lead to fewer neurons. And with an inadequate number of neurons, there will not be enough connections between those neurons either. When it happens later in pregnancy, as the brain cells are differentiating and connecting, there will be inadequate numbers of connections. Those nutrients are required to form synapses and to promote good growth of those connections. So there are a lot of good reasons for these lower cognitive scores, and it goes way beyond the poor homes that they live in after they're born. Here's what's especially scary. Folate and some other essential nutrients are especially important in the very early days of pregnancy, before most mothers know they're pregnant. So the neural tube closes about 28 days after conception. Many mothers are unaware that they're pregnant. Half of all pregnancies are unplanned. And so even though prenatal vitamins will be helpful after she goes to the doctor, the most important part of development of the lower brain is already past when she starts them. And we now know that mother's health status at conception is probably more important than what happens during pregnancy. Remember, the brain forms from the bottom up, and plasticity is key in experience. So the importance of folate to proper brain development was noticed in the 1960s when a researcher realized that there were far more defects in the neural tube part of the brain in women whose folate levels during pregnancy were too low. So given that Americans don't eat a lot of green vegetables, they realized that folic acid could be given in prenatal vitamins. And it took a little while for this to be recognized. A big clinical trial in the 1980s showed that we could prevent about 80% of neural tube defects with folic acid. And in 1998, the U.S. government mandated that proper levels of folic acid be added to all bread products. Now, why was this done? This was done because by the time women get their prenatal vitamins, that critical part of the brain has already developed. So it's really around the time of conception that levels of folate need to be high enough to help in formation of the lower brain. So in addition to these different products, ensures that most women, and it's mostly like bread and donuts and the things Americans tend to eat. So moving to another issue, but a highly important one. Remember way back in the beginning of this lecture, we talked a little bit about methylation tags that may hang on after conception and lead to epigenetic adaptations in the fetus to try to deal with the environment. And I would suggest to you, based on some of the research I've read, as well as a number of other authors who have put together the logic on this, that racism is a highly influential epigenetic factor. If you think about generations, it hasn't been that long since the days of slavery, which was followed by Jim Crow. Ever since, African Americans have endured greater stress daily due to poverty and all the things that happen in poverty. It would be unreasonable not to expect enhanced methylation changes in African Americans hanging on generation after generation. A recent study in Memphis, Tennessee found that African Americans have higher global methylation across their whole systems than whites in the same city, and even controlling on income. So what's going on? Several things are going on. One is Arlene Geronimus's suggestion of weathering. Geronimus compiled statistics by race for outcomes at birth and discovered that racism was influencing the healthiest age for women to have babies. So she summarized it, and I summarize here, as long-term effects that wither a woman, and that is start working to weaken her system early on. You can see the statistics in this next slide. So on the left, take a look. The best point for a white woman to have a baby, the lowest poor outcomes, and I believe this is infant mortality, 18 to 24, not quite as good. So it's really between 25 and 34, or even up to 39, that a white woman has the lowest level of poor outcomes. But go to the next one for African Americans, and what you see is that the lowest rates of poor outcomes for African American births are during the teenage years. Thereafter, they go up with passing time. And Geronimus suggested that the stress, the epigenetics effects of stress in African Americans' lives begin to age them early on in life. And in fact, we see African American women developing the chronic diseases of aging that white women develop about 20 years earlier. So the reproductive system is also affected. And then to the right, you see Mexican-born women, and these rates are pretty much lower. They look similar to white women, but they're lower than African-American women. Even though Mexican-born women are minorities, many of them are not affected by the racism that we see in this country. This may actually include Mexican citizens in Mexico who have much lower rates, partly due to different conditions. So this unit has suggested to you that gestation is probably the most important part of development in terms of setting up a person for the rest of his or her life. The fetus makes adaptations to survive the environment as communicated by the mother's life. And we see that racism and poverty have huge effects. So one question we might ask ourselves is, why is this the period when we spend the least on an individual, the period during pregnancy? In the next unit, we will talk about afterbirth and a little bit about where things started when the infant is born and how these effects are then accumulated further.